Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is a J-Man time, and today I have a video on some Afghan armored fighting vehicles that were in service during the Second World War. Now keep in mind, Afghanistan was not directly involved in World War II, as they remained neutral and did not pledge allegiance to either the Allied or Axis powers. But they did have diplomatic relations with both the Allied and Axis powers for most of the war. The only time they didn't was in 1941, when the Allied powers of the Soviet Union and Great Britain invaded Iran in what was known as the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran. During that 1 year, the Afghans tried to appease the Allies, but later on, in 1942, the Afghans would go back to being neutral and having diplomatic relations with both the Allied and Axis powers. But in this video, we're going to go over the tanks and armored cars and half-tracks that were in service with the Afghan army in the years before and during the Second World War. So let's go into that. And the first vehicle on the list is the French Renault FT-17 from 1917. And this was the first tank to serve in the Afghan army. In 1923, the King of Afghanistan, Amānullāh Khān, ordered 8 FT-17s from the Soviet Union, and these were delivered between 1923 and 1929. The FT-17 had a main armament of just one 37mm SA-18 main gun, but some were armed with a 7.62mm machine gun. These are the Soviet FT-17s we're talking about. The armor thickness was just 8 to 22mm, and the vehicle had a speed of 7 km per hour or 4.3 miles per hour and a crew of 2. These were ex-Polish FT-17s that were captured by the Soviet Union during the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 through 1921. They were later given to Afghanistan. In total, 8 of these vehicles were delivered between 1923 and 1929. In 1929, Afghanistan was in the middle of a civil war. Yes, this was the first Afghan civil war of the 20th century. And during the Afghan Civil War, you had the Kingdom of Afghanistan fighting against the Emirate of Afghanistan. The Kingdom of Afghanistan was led by King Amānullāh Khān and later on his son Mohammed Nādir Khān, and they were fighting the Saqqawists, which was an Islamic conservative movement led by Habibullāh Kalakāni, who was an Ex Royal Afghan army soldier who later became an Islamic bandit and later formed his movement known as the Saqqawist movement. And he later allied himself with another movement that was going on at the time in the Islamic world known as the Basmachi movement, which was an anti-Soviet movement that operated in the areas of the Soviet Union and bordering regions that was against both the Soviet ideology and Russian expansion into the Middle East. This conflict lasted from January until November of 1929. Now, Habibullāh Kalakāni actually took over the country of Afghanistan early in the conflict, dethroning King Amānullāh Khān, who later fled abroad. This left the country under the rule of the Saqqawists, who were against many of the allies of Amānullāh, especially the Shias and other non-Sunni factions living in Afghanistan. The reason Amānullāh Khān was overthrown is because he was trying to reform the country and he wanted Afghanistan to be more Western-oriented. He also tried to secularize the country, which many of the Islamic leaders on the ground level did not like, leading to many of them joining the Saqqawists and the Basmachi movement that later sparked in Afghanistan during the years before and during the 1929 Civil War. Now, the Saqqawists ruled the country until about August and September of 1929. During that time period, King Amānullah's son, Mohammed Nādir, later took over what was left of the Afghan forces, and he also allowed the Soviets to intervene in Afghanistan. This was the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. The Soviets sent 1,500 troops, along with the Soviet Air Force and a few dozen tanks and armored cars, including the remaining Renault FT-17s that were ordered by the Afghans in the years before the Civil War. The war ended at the end of 1929, and King Amānullāh and his son later returned as the leaders of Afghanistan. And later on in 1933, Prince Mohammed Nādir Khān, the son of Amānullāh, later became the king of Afghanistan, and he would launch his own reform of the Afghan army by purchasing more armored vehicles from the Soviet Union, but also non-Soviet countries like France, Italy, and later on Great Britain, and the United States. The Renault FT-17s would serve in the Afghan army during the Second World War, and they were still in service with the Afghan army as training tanks all the way up until the Soviet-Afghan War. During the Soviet-Afghan War, these Renault FT-17s, at least 2 or 3 of these vehicles, were still being used by pro-Soviet militias in Afghanistan as either stationary machine gun nests or as border guard and patrol vehicles with the Soviet and Soviet-Afghan army. And that brings us to the next armored fighting vehicle used by the Afghans in the years before and during the Second World War, and that is the Italian Fiat Ansaldo L3 and L3 series of Tankettes that were developed in the early 1930s. These Tankettes had a main armament of 2 6.5mm Fiat machine guns, and they had an armor thickness of about 6 to 12mm. The speed was 42 km per hour or 26 miles per hour, and these Tankettes had a crew of 2. In 1935, Afghanistan ordered 12 of these Tankettes from the Italians, and they were delivered between 1935 and 1936, and they would be the most modern tanks in the Afghan army for a couple of years. Now, these Tankettes actually served for a very long time. These L333 Tankettes were in service in the years before World War II, during World War II, and they survived the Cold War. In fact, these Italian Tankettes were still in service during the Soviet-Afghan War. During the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1970s and 80s, 6 of these Tankettes were still in service, and they had been rearmed with Soviet DShK heavy 50 caliber machine guns, or 12.7mm machine guns, instead of the old Italian 6.5mm machine guns. And they would serve in the pro-Soviet Afghan army all the way up until the end of the conflict. During the Afghan Civil War of the 1990s, these vehicles were captured by the Taliban and their allied forces who were still fighting the Afghan government, the remainder of the Soviet-backed Afghan government, all the way up until the end of 1992 and early 1993. These vehicles were probably still in service during the late 90s. When the Americans invaded Afghanistan in 2001, they rediscovered these old L333 tanks in the city of Kabul. Some of these tanks were intact, and some of these tanks were badly worn out. But in total, at least 3 to 6 of the L333s were recovered from Afghanistan, with 2 still remaining in Afghanistan as museum pieces in the country, and the remaining surviving tanks were later shipped abroad to be restored and placed in various museums around the world. So the L333 Tankette actually served for a very long time, and was probably the longest serving armored fighting vehicle in the Afghan army, the second longest anyway. And that leads us to the next tank on the list. The next tank used by the Afghan army comes all the way from the United States, and that is the American Disston Tractor Tanks that were developed in 1934. The Disston Tractor Tank was a series of agricultural tanks turned armored fighting vehicles that were sold by the U.S. to lesser nations that could not afford standard production armored fighting vehicles. Afghanistan purchased at least 10 to 12 of these Disston Tractor Tanks in 1937, and they would serve in the Afghan army all the way up until the end of the Soviet-Afghan War in 1989. The Disston Tractor Tank was a heavy tank from 1934, heavy tractor tank from 1934. The main armament was one 37mm American M1916 main gun, and it also had one 7.62mm Merlin machine gun as the secondary armament and a coaxial turret. The armor thickness was only 6 to 8mm, and the vehicle had a speed of just 5 to 6.5 miles per hour. The vehicle had a crew of just 3, and Afghanistan had between 10 and 12 of these Disston Tractor Tanks in service during the Second World War, and they were still in service throughout pretty much all of the Cold War. Later on, during the Soviet-Afghan War, these vehicles were rearmed with the Soviet 14.5mm KPVT heavy machine gun, which was the machine gun used on many Soviet infantry fighting vehicles, and they would serve in the Afghan army, the Soviet-Afghan army, all the way up until the end of that conflict in 1989. Later on, Afghanistan would collapse into civil war in the 1990s, and these vehicles were pretty much lost for many years, but they were later recovered in the year 2003-2004 by the U.S. coalition and a new Afghan government that currently runs Afghanistan now in 2021. These vehicles were never restored and are still located at various junkyards throughout Afghanistan. So these old Disston tractor tanks are still around as of 2021, and they were some of the longest serving armored fighting vehicles in Afghan history and in military history, as they were in service before even World War II began. The Disston tractor tank was literally the American Bob Simple tank of the Second World War. And then that leads us to the last tank used by the Afghan forces before and during the Second World War, and that is the Soviet T-26 model 1931. In 1935-1936, Afghanistan ordered 2 Soviet T-26 M1931s from the Soviet government. These were light tanks developed in 1931, and the T-26 overall was a Soviet copy of both the American Christie tank and the British Vickers Mark E light tank, which was a British export tank from the 1920s. The main armament was 2 7.62mm machine guns and 2 rotating turrets. The armor thickness was 10 to 15 millimeters, and the tank had a speed of 31.1 kilometers per hour or 19.3 miles per hour, and it had a crew of 3. Now, the Afghans only ordered 2 tanks, and they served from the 1930s until at least the 1950s, when they were finally replaced with Soviet-made T-34-85 medium tanks. In the 1940s and 50s, Afghanistan began ordering more modern tanks from the Soviet Union and armored vehicles from Great Britain, and they would order a ton of Soviet vehicles like the T-34-85 and even some British vehicles like the British Bren gun carrier, also known as the Universal Carrier, which was a tracked armored fighting vehicle used by the British before and during the Second World War. And those vehicles would go on to replace most of the tanks used by the Afghan army during the Cold War era. And let's go over some of the Afghan armored cars that were in service before and during the Second World War. And the first armored car on the list is the Italian Lancia 1ZM armored car from 1918. And these were standard Italian armored cars from the First World War. Overall, the Italians would construct about 140 of these vehicles between 1914 and 1921. The version the Afghans used was the 1ZM, which was developed in 1918. The main armament was either 2 or 3 7.62mm machine guns on the Afghan versions, although the Italian version used the 6.5mm Fiat machine guns. The armor thickness was only 9mm, and the vehicle had a speed of just 60 kilometers per hour, or 37 miles per hour, and the vehicle had a crew of 6. Now, in 1928, Italy gave 4 Lancia armored cars to Afghanistan as a gift from Mussolini to the Afghan government, or the Afghan king at this time, King Amānullāh Khān, who wasn't really a fascist but was a secularist actually. So it was pretty strange that a fascist leader would give weapons to a secularist leader, the leader of Afghanistan at the time. And these Lancia armored cars were one of only 3 armored fighting vehicles in service with the Afghan army during the Afghan Civil War of 1929 and later on during the Second World War. These Lancia armored cars served all the way up into the 1950s, when they were finally replaced with more modern Soviet and British armored cars during the Cold War. And later on during the American War in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2021, the U.S.-backed forces would find at least 2 of these Lancia armored cars largely intact, although missing some parts, in the Afghan junkyards in and around the city of Kabul. These Lancia armored cars were later transferred to Germany, where they were restored and are currently on display at the Military Museum in Dresden. So these Lancia armored cars actually served for about 20 to 30 years with the Afghan army and were later salvaged in the 21st century. But the Lancia armored car is not the strangest armored vehicle to show up in Afghanistan in the years before and during the Second World War. No, the strangest vehicle actually comes from France. In the 1920s, the French would develop the Citroën Tigras M1923, and this was a French half-track armored car that was later sold to Afghanistan in the late 1920s. The Citroën Tigras half-track was developed in 1923 and had a main armament of one 37mm SA-18 main gun plus one French 7mm machine gun, although this was later changed to a 7.62mm machine gun for the Afghan army. The armor thickness was only about 6 to 9 millimeters, and the vehicle had a speed of just 22.5 kilometers per hour or 14 miles per hour and a crew of 2. Now, Afghanistan received at least 2 to 4 of these half-tracks between 1925 and 1927 from France, and they would serve in the Afghan army all the way up until the late 40s or early 50s, when they were finally replaced by more modern tracked armored fighting vehicles like the British Bren gun carrier. Later on, many decades later, in the year 2004, at least 2 of these half-tracks were later found by the American forces in Afghanistan, although they were in a pretty terrible shape. They were later transferred to the US for restoration, although they are on display at least 2 museums in the United States. These 2 half-tracks are the rarest of the French half-tracks and are the only 2 surviving Citroën Tigras M1923 half-tracks in the world. The French only produced about 17 of these half-tracks between 1923 and 1925, making them some of the rarest armored fighting vehicles to be used by the French army during the years before and during World War II, but also the Afghan army in the years before and during World War II, and even in the early Cold War era. And there you have it. These were the armored fighting vehicles of the Afghan army in the years before and during the Second World War. Which were your favorites? If I had to choose, mine would be the Disston Tractor Tank and the French Citroën Tigras M1923 half-tracks, as those are rare and most people don't know about them. But what were your favorites? Please tell me in the comment section below. And until next time, this was a J-Man Time signing off.